Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 16 of This Week is Live. I'm your host, Raymond Flotat from MXDWN.com. That's Mixdown. So glad to see you well. A lot to cover today and tons of stuff flying in a bunch of different directions. We have to start today, unfortunately, yet again, on some very sad news. On Super Bowl Sunday, minutes before kickoff, and most of America was tuning in to their, biggest annual sports event, Trugoy the Dove, who was one of the main three members of the famed hip hop group De La Soul, passed away. Now, as of press time, there's not a lot in terms of details, in terms of exactly what happened, in terms of his passing. But what little information is known is that Dave Jolicoeur, as his real name is, or Trugoy the Dove, as he was known as his stage name, had had a long history with congestive heart failure and had even worn what was called a life vest defibrillator machine. Recently, interesting to point out that De La Soul joined many, many, many hip hop greats at the Grammys for Questlove's big tribute to, the several decades of existence of hip hop as a whole. And effectively, the other members of the band, Maceo and Posnuis, or, Plug One, were there, but Trugoy the Dove was not. Now, Trugoy was a wonderful part of what is widely regarded in hip hop circles as one of the best hip hop bands basically ever, and effectively did what is regarded as three of the best hip hop records ever made in their trilogy of albums that Prince Paul produced, no less Prince Paul, 3 Feet High and Rising, De La Soul is Dead, and Balloon Mind State. And effectively, regarded as one of the very best of that early golden age period in the late 80s, early 90s of hip hop. And depending on who you talk to, alternate hip hop or jazzy, jazz affected psychedelic hip hop, kind of in that far side realm of things from the early 90s. And of course, De La Soul has become legendary in the world of turntablism, in the world of, people who aren't a fan of giant, big mainstream hip hop that, of course, took over in the 90s and into the early 2000s. And not to be outdone, also incredibly famous for their collaborations with Gorillaz. As most of you probably know, on Gorillaz' famed 2005 album, Demon Days, De La Soul in their entirety, but mostly Trugoy the Dove in terms of what you hear on the song, were a big part of the song Feel Good Incorporated. They also then later collaborated with Gorillaz again on the song Superfast Jellyfish and the album Plastic Beach. And then lastly, on the song Moments from the Gorillaz album Humans. Effectively, wonderful, wonderful guy. Incredible lyricist, incredible rapper, had done a lot of really amazing stuff. I wore my Gorillaz shirt today in honor of Trugoy and everything that they accomplished. I have a bunch of happy memories myself of having seen Gorillaz in person when De La Soul showed up to join them numerous times, not the least of which being, I don't know if you can call it a Gorillaz set, but it was effectively when not De La Soul, excuse me, when Damon Albarn had been, his solo record had come out and he was playing at the Fader Fort at South by Southwest, and he had a headlining slot at that year's Fader Fort that particular day, and it was super, super long set filled with a lot of the slower material that was his solo album at that point. And then effectively he did a bunch of Gorilla songs where a bunch of people joined him. And of course, De La Soul joined him to do Feel Good Incorporated, and that was the performance where it was the very first time that Clint Eastwood had been done with Del the Funky Opusamy and Dan the Automator at the same time, actually there doing it, the original guys from the very first Gorillaz album. But then, of course, De La Soul played with Gorillaz numerous times at many of their major festival stops and locations, not the least of which being their headlining Coachella set. And it was always, always wonderful to see them do their thing as a part of what Gorillaz was doing. So a huge, huge rest in peace for Trugoy the Dove and everything that he accomplished and everything that he did in hip hop, and for all the millions and millions of fans out there. As a final kind of interesting note on this, just coincidentally, nothing really to do with anything, but on January 3rd of this year, De La Soul had finally announced, after many, many years of not being able to bring their catalog to streaming services, that in in March, on March 3rd, effectively, they will finally be bringing their first 6 albums to streaming services. And I'm not a big fan of streaming myself, but I know a lot of people out there are. And if you're one of those people that's a big fan of streaming, effectively, you'll finally be able to hear your favorite De La Soul records on your streaming service of choice. Apparently, they got caught up in tons of different rights negotiations and rights renegotiations over the years in terms of trying to make that a reality. And of course, a lot of their music was very sample heavy in that early period when, it's kind of the wild, wild west, kind of like, Beastie Boys, Paul's Boutique, where effectively, wouldn't even be legally possible nowadays to have that many samples cleared. And, contracts would need to be updated to make those kinds of things a reality. So we don't have anything in terms of the exact true cause of death. And it's the kind of thing where a lot of times when things like this happen, it may be a long time before that's ever announced, before that's ever indicated. It could be that we never find out, kind of like what's going on with Mark Lanigan, where there's been over a year and there's still no word on exactly what happened or why he passed away. So, moving on into happier news in the world of music, also, Megadeth has announced that they're going to be reuniting with their former second co-lead guitarist, Marty Friedman. Now, if you're not really big into the world of metal, and if you're not really familiar with, what metal or thrash metal is, Marty Friedman was one of the better guitar players ever to come out of the thrash metal era, and was a part of two of the very best, well, three, depending on if you count Euthanasia, two of the very, very best Megadeth records, which are in some respects from that original Slayer, Metallica, Anthrax, thrash metal scene that came up in the mid to late 80s, early 90s. Probably two of the very best records out of all of the records that are there. And I know a lot of people probably have different opinions on that, so I'm going to big argument with people. But effectively, Megadeth's albums Rust in Peace and Countdown to Extinction, which, variably, Rust in Peace is probably one of the most credible thrash records that has ever been made, and it's just technical ecstasy and ridiculous and insane and fast and all kinds of stuff going on. And then Countdown to Extinction was basically Megadeth's breakthrough record, where they had their big hits and their songs, like Symphony of Destruction and Sweating Bullets, that became staples of their career ever since. And Marty Friedman was a huge part of that. An incredible guitar player, also very good classical guitar, and stayed with the band all the way until 2000. And then, famously left the group. And there's lots of different things as to why, and we're not going to get into all that. But one thing I do remember from that time frame was that Marty Friedman expressed sadness in that at that point there was a chance for Megadeth to play Budokan, the famed giant stadium in Japan, and it didn't happen for them at that point. And, then after that, shortly after that, he left the band. And so what's happened is they've announced that, Megadeth and Marty Friedman have announced that for one night only, they are going to be playing together again at Budokan in Japan, and they're going to be doing a set together. Marty Friedman, since leaving Megadeth, has actually been living in Japan, has been doing a lot there, and of course, occasionally collaborating with artists in Japan and the Kai rock scene there, which is where, like X Japan comes out of. And effectively, they're going to be doing one show coming up on February 27th, which is going to be live streamed from Budokan, and it's going to be them together for the first time in 23 years. Now, if you're so inclined and you're a big fan, they're going to be selling tickets to the live stream to this for $15, which isn't terrible considering it's kind of a once in a lifetime thing. But interesting to note, the show is going to be happening at what is effectively 1 a.m. Pacific time, which of course for you East Coast folks is 4 a.m. Eastern time. So you might have to calibrate your schedules or your sleep. Hopefully there's some re-airing of it. Depends. Different live stream services do that. Different live stream services don't. Also, moving on into the world of games, Double Fine Productions, which is quite famously the development studio made by Tim Schafer. Tim Schafer is the guy behind the famed comedic games Psychonauts, Broken Age, and many other kind of very cute kind of graphical adventure games. Double Fine has just announced that on the back of what was a pretty amazing Kickstarter, well, not Kickstarter, it was a part of what is a Kickstarter as far as common terms, but it was from Fig, which is a fundraising platform designed for helping fund and own video games, that their game Psychonauts 2, which came out a couple years ago, just before the pandemic hit, they have now I'm not kidding, 32 episode, 22-hour making of documentary, basically chronicling everything from stem to sternum over the many years that it took to make this game. Now, this one was another one of those, Psychonauts was a game that was beloved and had incredible reviews, but wasn't really, super successful in the AAA video game system in the early 2000s, where it wasn't moving tons and tons of units. And of course, big companies are like big movies where they need to see giant profits in order for it to be worth it. And the first Psychonauts didn't do that, but everybody who played it loved it. So basically they went to fans in the audience to raise money to be able to create it. And through this Fig investment protocol that they did, they basically raised $4 million, and they were working towards totally putting it together and releasing it independently. And then, interestingly, right before the game was scheduled to come out, basically Microsoft announced that they had acquired Double Fine Studios completely, and that Double Fine is now a part of the Xbox team of game studios. So effectively, this is the documentary chronicling that whole process from stem to sternum and everything that went into it. And it is very long. And of course, it is the kind of thing where if you're not familiar with what it takes to make video games, this is the kind of thing that will show you it is very hard. This isn't the kind of thing that you can just do with a handful of people and have it be good or big or great. Maybe a lot of the early classic games in the 80s could be done on a shoestring with a small budget, but when you're doing anything in the common terms of what most people expect of video games in the AAA arena, it is a very, very costly endeavor to make it a reality. Elsewhere in the world of television, a lot of folks are going to be happy because Ted Lasso is returning. And Ted Lasso is the story of the character by the same name, who had basically been conscripted kind of as an intentional joke, almost like the plot of the original, baseball movie Major League, to essentially torpedo a particular football club or soccer club as we know it here in America, and effectively then turning out to be a really great coach, and everyone on the team falling in love with him. It's a pretty heartwarming and incredible comedy, and if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It plays on Apple's streaming service, Apple TV. It's one of the few really good things up on Apple TV, and of course, because of that, most of the major cast members, and Jason Sudeikis and Bryce Goldstein and Hannah Waddingham, have all won awards behind it. And it takes a few years before each season happens, but effectively for a comedy, it's one of the best comedies on TV in a lot of years, kind of harkening back to that golden era where there was Cheers and Seinfeld and Frasier and everything. There isn't many comedies like this, not many sitcoms that are really, really well done and really, really well written, and also really funny at the same time. So season 3 is going to return March 15th. So if that's something that you're interested in, be ready in terms of Apple TV. And then lastly, here today, pretty much right now, wherever you are in America right now, Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania. Yes, it's a mouthful. The third Ant-Man movie following Ant-Man and then Ant-Man and the Wasp is basically out now. I had the privilege of being able to go to a press screening earlier this week to see it and write about it. I wrote a review that's in detail. It's up on Mixdown on our movie site if you're interested in knowing more. It's pretty much spoiler free. I mean, they do tell you quite a lot of the plot in the trailer, so I'm not telling you anything that you can't surmise completely obviously from the trailer. But effectively, it might be what I would call their first misstep, and a lot of the other reviews from other major press has said basically the same thing. It's not a bad movie. It's a good movie, and it's not terrible. There's certainly far worse things that have been made, and especially in the superhero arena. But it isn't quite the standard that I think most folks expect from what the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Marvel Studios are capable of. Paul Rudd is good in his own way. So is Evangeline Lilly. Most importantly, Michael Douglas does a really, really great job, but pretty much everything kind of banks on Jonathan Majors and the portrayal of what's now going to become the big bad guy for the next 12 or so movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is Jonathan Majors' portrayal of Kang the Conqueror, and perhaps variants. I don't know. We'll see what that means as they get further into the story. This was obviously introduced and teased a bit in the first season of Loki on Disney Plus, where Loki and Sylvie at the end of that show met with He Who Remains, which is a version of Kang. So effectively, much and more is going to hinge on whether you think that Jonathan Majors' performance here is worth the price of admission. It's great. He does a really good job, and it's really foreboding, and it's really kind of commanding and scary in every way that something this bad would be. But of course, you have to take that with Ant-Man as a whole. And it looks like Ant-Man as a whole suffered as a result of this needing to be crammed down this pipe for Kang the Conqueror to be introduced. And, to put it this way, Ant-Man was always great because it had that kind of mirthful Paul Rudd humor. It was somewhat family friendly. It was somewhat enjoyable and pleasant. It wasn't too dark. It was certainly action and fighting in its own points. But at the end of the day, what was good about it was how it was different from other superhero movies. Every other superhero movie has its own kind of ebb and flow, and with the exception of like the Infinity War and Endgame movies from the Avengers, or Captain America Civil War, which had a different arc all its own. Most superhero movies have their kind of set format, introducing a character, introducing a problem, introducing a villain, a big showdown at the end. Ant-Man was always the funny Marvel movie, the one that you could count on for a lot of really great humor and a lot of, really kind of easygoing kind of jokes and, silly situations. This basically throws that all aside. There's a couple minutes of that in the beginning of the movie, and then most of the rest of the movie is all in the quantum realm where they're introducing where they're introducing Kang. and there's this whole adventure there, and it's, it's very Star Wars like. I would not call it Star Wars. It's obviously not cemented in that as a reality, but there's a lot of it that is really interesting and colorful characters. There's a lot of really beautiful backgrounds, but then of course that means that even though it's really, really well animated and it's really expensive, obviously, to look at, it still is obvious that there's a bunch of people standing around in front of the green screen. So it is a good movie. It's not bad, but it's pretty much going to hinge on how you feel about Jonathan Majors in his performance, because you're either going to be like, holy cow, this is amazing, and this guy is going to be terrible, and that's going to be a wonderful antagonist for all the extended Marvel movies to come, or you're going to be like, oh boy, this is going to be a lot for a while. So see it for yourself, judge for yourself. There's a lot of diehard Marvel fans out there, obviously. But for me, for my money, this might have been one of the few movies, except for the Eternals, of course, which for Marvel, usually incredibly high quality in their output, just a little bit off the mark. Obviously, the movie's just coming out today, this evening. They're late night screenings, and then Friday, tomorrow, will be the big first release. And so we'll be having reporting all throughout the weekend on Mixdown in terms of its box office numbers and how it does. Anytime Marvel puts out a movie, they do huge numbers in terms of their box office fare and how well they're performing. So we'll be covering that in detail. See it for yourself. Let us know what you think. And then lastly for this week, there's a lot of things that I've been thinking about in terms of stories for this week that I wanted to share. And there's a lot of different topics I was considering on. And something kind of pushed its way into my brain very late in the last couple of days. It kind of became impossible for me to ignore, because to me, it's just kind of a sad story. And it's the kind of thing where I don't think enough time and attention is paid. And I think also the pace of media and the pace of culture is always focused on RU21. And so that means things that might have just happened 10 years ago, and this did just happen just over 10 years ago, are almost like they never happened at all. Things just keep moving. People keep moving. Time and culture just keeps moving on. So it was basically announced that the band Typo Negative was putting out a series of releases that were live recordings of some of their last shows and tours. And essentially, one of the videos was from the festival Wacken Open Air, which is one of the big European heavy metal festivals. And it was from the Typo Negative song, their performance at that festival for Love You to Death. And it was a great reminder for me of just how wonderful a band they were and how special what they did, even though it wasn't always serious, even though sometimes it was deliberately offensive in its own way, but it was kind of a wonderful, unique, strange little island. So, I mean, to unpack this a bit for you, if you're not already familiar with Typo Negative, they were a band that also included keyboards, so your typical bass, drums, guitar, but they also had, very creepy sounding kind of keyboards that were fronted by a guy named Peter Steele. Peter Steele was 6'8", and he was a serious bodybuilder, and he was a guy that was in incredible shape, had long black hair, and in the 90s, girls loved him. The girls were all about Peter Steele. And he also had a bit of a Nosferatu kind of thing going on. Sometimes would appear in videos with caps and for fangs, and effectively, had an incredibly deep voice. And he sang like he was Dracula in some respects. Now, if you really go back into the history of like a lot of the classic vintage goth music, you're going to find lots of instances of guys singing with incredibly rich baritone, bass-heavy voices. And so this wasn't unheard of. What was kind of different was that Typo Negative was kind of a medley between that kind of early 80s goth rock and then heavy metal. And so they were kind of a mix of that. And they would kind of go whatever way they want. What was really kind of interesting and special about them was that they had no fear in terms of taking their time on a song. Songs would often go 2-3 extra choruses. Songs would sometimes go an extra 8 minutes longer than normal people would do it. It's pretty well written about that their masterpiece album, Bloody Kisses, was an affair. And this is actually a lot of reporting that was pretty excellently done by Pitchfork. Pitchfork did a couple of years ago this wonderful dissection of what went into making Bloody Kisses. And effectively, and this was their 1993 album, that a lot of what Bloody Kisses was something that Peter Steele wrote while he was basically, sitting in line driving a dump truck, disposing of toxic chemicals at a waste disposal plant. And he'd be stuck in line a lot of times waiting for his truck's turn to bring in. This was his day job. And he wrote a lot of the songs and the lyrics that would ultimately end up being that album there. And then the band all kind of put it together and shopped it around to labels. And then famously, Roadrunner tried to bring in producers to say, hey, what would you do with this? And a lot of the people looked at it and were like, you're crazy. This is done. And if you hear the record, you'll see basically what was going on there. They obviously had a vision for what they were trying to accomplish with that album. And it has kind of a nexus point between a New England hayride kind of like world weary, loving being with people together kind of vibe to confrontations with the media and culture and people's perceptions with them. And there's some really heavy, fast thrash songs. They do a dead-on Seals and Croft cover of the song Summer Breeze, and then they combine it with their song She Sets Me on Fire, and it's just gorgeous and beautiful. They spend a 12-minute song, Black Number One, talking about ostensibly a woman with hair dye and how she didn't want to go outside. She was so goth because she didn't have the right dye for her hair, and she didn't want her roots to show, as the song lyrics go. And then a song that I won't get into too much detail here, which is The Amazing Christian Woman, which basically is, kind of playing with the notion of sex and God and Jesus Christ, and him toying with the notion of godlike status and, I guess you could say, the bedroom, but you'll have to listen to the song for yourself. I'm not going to get too deep into interpreting here. But what's wonderful about the album is that it's one of the rare albums that goes really, really long, literally to the last second. In those days when we were only on compact discs, to the last second of the compact disc. The last song, I Can't Lose You, literally just ends when there's no more room on the CD. There's no more room for it. Now, that wouldn't mean much in the streaming era, but in those days, it was nuts to think that you could go 80 minutes worth of music in one album. This album, for me personally, has always been a really wonderful thing to experience while driving. You've got hundreds of miles you've got to click away in terms of traversing a certain area. Then this album, the songs being longer, the choruses being more extra, kind of helps the time pass really, really well. It also is very much a Halloween record. And so much of it deals in kind of the fun, spooky playfulness of Halloween and the kind of the goth culture and around New York and New England. And effectively, it's always been a staple in my life to basically crack this out and listen to this again when Halloween rolls around. And if you've got any tolerance for things that are metal or goth and you don't know this, you should absolutely listen to Typo Negative's Bloody Kisses. The song itself, Bloody Kisses, I might point out, and this is a new fact I didn't know for many years, effectively is a super long song with subtitled The Death in the Family, and it's just miserable and super, super sad. It's like the one really, really sad song on that album. But apparently, Peter Steele, the lead singer, was an avowed cat lover. And it's a song about how his cat died. And it's a song about how he didn't think he could go on because his cat died. And it's about 12 minutes long. You would think otherwise to listen to it. But effectively, in those days, Typo Negative often did tours of New England, and they were always their big Halloween tour, kind of right around Halloween and leading up to Halloween. I saw them in New York, and effectively, on one of their big Halloween tours, I think it was in 1997 when I saw them in the Roseland Ballroom in New York City. And effectively, in that tour, they ostensibly, at the end of the show, they'd dump out like 20 boxes of toilet paper, and then the whole crowd was just throwing toilet paper and, catching it, and there'd be toilet paper flying all around the audience. It was a wonderful, wonderful little piece of culture. Now, fast forward many years later to Mixdown here and living in Los Angeles, they did a tour with Hatebreed, which is a Connecticut hardcore band that the lead singer, Jamie Jost, is kind of his own cottage industry in and of himself. And they did kind of like a co-headlining tour. It was like put on by, I think, Jägermeister, and it was like a sponsored kind of tour thing. And so it was the first time I had seen them in many, many, many years at that point, and they were still great and still incredibly long songs, and Peter Steele still sounding like Nosferatu. And it was really sad that just a couple years after the video of Love You to Death that was just released online the other day happened, where Peter Steele tragically died. And he was only 48 years old at the time of his passing. And effectively, there was a lot of, I think you could say, incorrect reporting that came out at the time when this all happened. It's music, so everybody assumes drug abuse or drug overdose. And I think there was a lot of early reports in that early phase that assumed drug overdose because Peter still had a chronicled problem with substance abuse and alcoholism, and he had been clean for a good number of years. But apparently, that wasn't that, and the truth didn't come out for quite a while. And apparently, people spent a whole lot of time thinking it was was heart failure, that he had a heart attack, and turned out that it was actually sepsis caused by diverticulitis. And if you don't know what diverticulitis is, we're not going to have a big medical sermon here on the show, but you should look it up. It's horrible, and it's not fun for if you've known anyone who suffers from diverticulitis, excuse me. And effectively, I guess years of substance abuse, his organs were weak, and the diverticulitis spilled over into sepsis, and that is ultimately what caused him to die. And it's crazy tragic. I mean, he's 48 years old. I mean, there was a point. It's kind of hard to imagine, in this world. I don't think you hear much about these kinds of things in those days. But Type O Negative made major headlines in the '90s because Peter Steele, being a bit of a heartthrob, as a 6'8" guy with long black hair, was incredibly muscle bound. He was one of the first, and maybe one of the only that I can remember, musicians that posed for Playgirl. He did a nude photo shoot for Playgirl, like right at the apex of their popularity in the early '90s, and that, of course, had headlines for days behind that. And just 20 years later, the poor guy passed away. And it was on April 14th, 2010. I will never forget that, because that was actually, for me, the particular year I was going to Coachella. And it was the morning I was heading out that the news broke that happened. And effectively, that band's never going to exist again. I mean, if you hear the way this guy sings, nobody sounds like that. I mean, there's certainly people with deep baritone voices, and there are other goth bands with deep baritone voices, but nobody had this guy's voice. Nobody sounded quite like what he did, and he was really kind of perfect for those players in the band, Josh Silver and Kenny Hickey. And, effectively, that was pretty much the end. I mean, they've done reissues, they've done re-releases. I believe his original band Carnivore did, some kind of a Carnivore 25 kind of thing where they did a reunion of the other guys, but without Peter Steele. But you could never have a band like Type O Negative and ever do it without him. There's no one that would sound like that. And that's why most of these guys who were members of the band are all off doing other projects and other things. But I mean, it's a shame, because a lot of people never really got to see what that was or what he was capable of. And it's kind of a sad thing in the music business that, that whole cliche of the good die young, right? Like, too many wonderful, brilliant people don't get to last to make it, to see the payday, to see the end of the rainbow, the happiness and easy, comfortable retirement that they deserve. And, whatever problems Peter still did have, he cleaned himself up and was taking care of himself, was still cranking out albums and making music. I mean, over a period of, 7 records that were happening that were really great. But unfortunately, time expired and Peter was gone. And it's really kind of been a nice memory for me revisiting that and just remembering that, because there's so much talk in music and there's so much thought. I mean, millions of bands everywhere trying to find exposure and trying to make a name for themselves, and bands and gimmicks and things. And there's a lot of talk when you get into what does it really take to be amazing in the world of music about finding your voice. People always talk about that. And it's kind of one of those, well, what the hell does that mean kind of things? What is finding your voice? And, in some respects, it's finding that pocket where you exist in. Some extents, it's finding what way of interfacing with music is it that you exist in. And I mean, take a look at like James Hetfield from Metallica, or take a look at David Bowie, and take a look at Prince and the subtle different ways that they sing. Think of Neil Young. Think of like the way that he might approach singing and songwriting. And there was something really wonderful in Peter Steele and Type O Negative, in that this was its own lane, all on its own, totally just kind of in its own place, in its own pocket, never really needed anybody else or any approval for anyone else, just had its own lane in terms of what it needed to be. I mean, if there's ever been an instance of, wow, that's a unique voice, I mean, that was it. So this is the kind of thing, if you don't know, I highly recommend you check it out. Take the time, go look into this, reach past your comfort zone, see if you can find some things like this. And of course, most recently, there is the live version from Walking Open Air of Love You to Death, and it's gorgeous. I mean, it's a little less metal than a lot of the Type O Negative fare that they're famous for. If you want to listen to Black Number One or Christian Woman, or, some of the stuff that was from Bloody Kisses, or, October Rust, the album that followed. But it's beautiful. So I highly recommend it if you haven't. Rest in peace, Peter Steele, all these years later. And hopefully every one of you out there is doing very well. That's it for this week's show and this week's episode. Thank you again so much for joining us for episode 16 of This Week is Live. We're going to be back every week at the same time, roughly Thursday afternoon, roughly 5:30 p.m. And then, of course, we take these, and after we do this live on Twitch, we promote this and publish this out on YouTube and other platforms for any of you who watch and engage with our content, and any of the places that you find it in Instagram and Twitter and YouTube and YouTube Shorts. We thank you. Please subscribe to us on YouTube if you don't already. Please follow us on Twitch if you don't already. We'll be here every week, and we'll have more headlines for you, more interesting stories, and maybe some surprises. We'll see how it goes over the next few months, but we're going to keep that kind of tight-lipped for now. So for now, we'll be back next week. Thank you so much for joining us. So glad to see you well.